She stepped over the gate on who? Jonathan, let her talk because this will be my last time playing with you and with your people. Because I don't like how you, me and her apologize.
I don't care, you're a liar.
You're a liar.
Okay.
And that's why you went to jail, because you're the liar.
Because I tell the truth.
You're lying. You're lying right now. She just said she came over the gate. She had her leg over the gate and her hands and her arms on me. And I didn't know who the f it was. So when I turned around, yes, I moved her back, but I still didn't know why she was on me. That's not in my head like, oh, Jonathan's girlfriend is here and she's getting ready to hop over the fucking gate. For what? She could have just pointed to you and told you to come get her. But no, what you say? I ain't bring sand to the beach. Now am I a liar? Thank you. That's what you did last time too. You played games with me.
I don't know what you're talking about anymore.
Jonathan, you play too many games.
Come on, bring sand to the beach. I brought sand to the beach.
I asked you, why didn't you just have her go around and
Stop scrolling because this wasn't just tea. This was someone emptying the whole kettle. In part 2, Blueface didn't hint, joke, or dance around it. He aired it out. Calm voice, straight face, no build-up. Just statements that landed heavy and stayed there. The kind of details people whisper off camera but never expect to hear said out loud, especially on a platform where nothing disappears. And the wildest part, he didn't sound angry. He sounded done. That's when everything got real. Because once the first piece of Karlissa's tea spilled, the tone shifted instantly. This wasn't messy reality TV drama anymore. It felt like someone finally saying the quiet parts after holding them in for too long. Fans leaned in. Comment sections froze. You could feel the collective weight. Did he really just say that? Ripple across the timeline. And remember, this is part 2, which means whatever restraint existed before. Gone. Reactions exploded not because of how loud it was, but because of how controlled it felt. No yelling, no theatrics, just information dropped like it was overdue. And when someone speaks that calmly while exposing something personal, it raises one question nobody can ignore. Why now? Because when tea comes out this clean, this confident, and this public, it's usually not about clout. It's about clearing the record no matter who gets uncomfortable. And trust this reaction video isn't just commentary. It's the moment everything clicks. Nobody expected part 2 to feel this different, because part 1 already had people buzzing. Fans thought they'd seen the worst of it. They thought whatever tension existed had already peaked. But part 2 didn't come in loud, it came in measured, and that's what made it unsettling. Blueface didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He didn't perform. He spoke like someone who had already decided he was done protecting feelings. And when someone reaches that point, the tone shifts from drama to disclosure. Viewers picked up on it immediately. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was calculated clarity. From the very beginning of part 2, it was obvious Blueface wasn't here to tease or bait reactions. He went straight to specifics. Not vague jabs, not coded language. He laid out details in a way that suggested he'd been holding this in for a long time. That's why the room felt tense even through the screen. People could tell this wasn't spontaneous. This was something he'd rehearsed internally, maybe even argued with himself about, before finally deciding to say it out loud. And when that realization hit, the audience wasn't just watching content anymore, they were watching a boundary being crossed. The tea about Karlissa didn't spill all at once. It came out in pieces, each one heavier than the last. Blueface framed it not as an attack, but as context. That distinction mattered. He wasn't trying to embarrass her, he was trying to explain himself. And explanations are dangerous when they involve other people because they rewrite narratives that have already settled in the public's mind. As he spoke, fans began rethinking old arguments, old interviews, old moments where Karlissa's perspective had dominated the conversation. Suddenly, those moments didn't feel as clear-cut anymore. What really caught people off guard was how calm Blueface remained throughout. No sarcasm, no jokes, no smugness. Just a steady tone that suggested exhaustion more than anger. That calmness gave his words weight. It made listeners wonder how long he'd been biting his tongue. and it made the tea feel less like gossip and more like overdue clarification. Reaction creators paused more often than usual, replaying clips, rereading comments, trying to process what had just been said. The vibe wasn't hype, it was disbelief. As details stacked up, viewers began noticing a pattern in how Blueface spoke about Karlissa. He didn't demonize her outright. Instead, he painted a picture of ongoing tension, misrepresentation, and control behind the scenes. He implied that certain narratives had been shaped intentionally and that he'd allowed it to happen for the sake of peace or at least silence. That admission alone reframed everything. Silence, in this context, wasn't innocence. It was endurance. And once endurance runs out, truth tends to spill hard. The internet reacted in waves. The first wave was shocked people trying to figure out if he'd really just said what they thought he said. The second wave was analysis. Fans went back to old clips involving Karlissa, listening more carefully, noticing things they'd brushed off before: tone, timing, choice of words. Suddenly, what once felt like parental concern to some started looking like something more complicated. And whether people agreed with Blueface or not, they couldn't ignore the shift. What made Part 2 especially explosive was that it didn't exist in isolation. It came after months of tension, speculation, and unfinished conversations. People had already sensed something was off, but they didn't have language for it. Blueface gave them that language. And once language exists, narratives move fast. Comment sections filled with phrases like "this explains a lot and now it makes sense." That's when you know a story has cracked open. Not when people argue, but when they connect dots on their own. Reaction videos amplified that process. Creators weren't just reacting emotionally. They were contextualizing, breaking down body language, comparing statements, asking why this was coming out now. And the timing mattered. Part 2 dropped when tensions were already high, when fans were already primed to listen closely. It felt less like content scheduling and more like a moment that couldn't be held back anymore. Karlissa's name trending alongside T added another layer of discomfort. This wasn't a random influencer being exposed, it was family. And family dynamics make everything messier, because loyalty, resentment, and power blur together. Blueface seemed aware of that. He chose his words carefully, which only made the implications louder. He didn't accuse directly, but he suggested enough to unsettle long-held assumptions. That approach forced viewers to sit with ambiguity rather than rush to a verdict. The reaction audience split almost immediately. Some applauded Blueface for finally speaking his truth, arguing that silence had only allowed narratives to harden against him. Others criticized him for airing family issues publicly, saying it crossed a line regardless of context. But even critics admitted something felt different about this episode. It didn't feel like clout chasing. It felt like someone reclaiming their voice. Consequences began. As Part 2 continued circulating, the story stopped being about tea and started being about control of narrative. Who gets believed? Who gets to speak first? Who benefits from silence? Blueface's calm delivery suggested he understood those dynamics well and had decided he was done playing his assigned role. That realization unsettled people, because it meant more might come out. And once that door opens, it rarely closes neatly. By the end of Part 2, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a reaction-worthy moment, it was a pivot. A moment where long-standing tensions finally surfaced without filters. Fans weren't just reacting to what was said. They were bracing for what might be said next. Because when someone airs out tea this deliberately, it's usually not the full cup. It's the beginning of a pour. And that's what made Part 2 feel heavier than anything before it. Not because it was louder, but because it felt final. As Part 2 continued to ripple across the timeline, the initial shock wore off and something more intense took its place: reassessment. People weren't just reacting to what Blueface said anymore, they were reevaluating everything they thought they knew. That's when a situation becomes dangerous, because reassessment doesn't fade quickly. It lingers. Viewers replayed clips not to be entertained, but to listen more carefully. Tone mattered now. Word choice mattered. Even pauses felt intentional. The calmness Blueface maintained throughout part 2 became the centerpiece of the discussion. It didn't read as confidence for clout. It read as someone who had reached a point where holding things in felt more damaging than saying them out loud. What stood out immediately was how structured his airing out felt. This wasn't rambling. It wasn't impulsive. It followed a logic, almost like a timeline being corrected in real time. Blueface framed his points in a way that suggested he was responding to long-standing narratives rather than creating new ones. That distinction mattered to viewers. It made his words feel reactive, not aggressive, as if he was finally addressing a version of himself that had been circulating without his consent. People noticed how often he referenced misunderstandings, assumptions, and things being taken the wrong way. That language signaled frustration not with one moment, but with years of accumulated misrepresentation. As fans absorbed that, the conversation around Karlissa shifted again. It became less about her personally and more about her role in shaping public perception. Viewers debated whether she had spoken out of concern, control, or something in between. Blueface never outright labeled her intentions, but he didn't have to. By describing how situations unfolded behind the scenes, he invited the audience to draw their own conclusions. And audiences are far more convinced by conclusions they feel they reach themselves. That's why this episode hit harder than direct accusations ever could. Reaction creators played a huge role in this phase. Instead of exaggerating moments for laughs, many slowed the footage down, paused frequently, and emphasized nuance. That alone told viewers this was different. This wasn't a clip to joke about and move on from. It required unpacking. Some creators pointed out how Blueface consistently avoided name-calling, even while discussing deeply personal issues. Others noted that he acknowledged his own faults briefly, which added credibility to the rest of what he was saying. Admitting imperfections softened resistance. It made his airing out feel less like blame and more like context. The audience response became more polarized but also more thoughtful. Supporters argued that Blueface had every right to speak after staying silent for so long. Critics argued that family matters shouldn't be handled publicly, no matter the circumstances. But both sides agreed on one thing: this didn't feel random. The timing, the tone, and the structure all suggested this was something he'd wrestled with internally. That realization changed how people judged him. Even those who disagreed with airing out the tea admitted it felt intentional rather than reckless. Another layer emerged as fans connected this episode to previous conflicts. Old interviews where Blueface appeared defensive suddenly made more sense. Moments where he seemed disengaged now look like restraint. Silence, once interpreted as avoidance, was reinterpreted as survival. That reframing was powerful. It allowed viewers to see his past behavior not as indifference, but as someone navigating a situation where speaking carried consequences. And once that idea took hold, the narrative around control and voice became central. Karlissa's absence during this phase only intensified speculation. No immediate response. No clarification. No counter-narrative. For some, that silence validated Blueface's claims. For others, it was proof that the situation was more complicated than either side was letting on. But regardless of interpretation, the lack of response created space for Blueface's version to dominate. In public discourse, the first detailed account often sets the tone. And part 2 was detailed enough to anchor perception. As the days passed, people began asking, not was he right, but why did this reach this point? That's a deeper question, and it pulled attention away from surface-level drama into structural issues: communication breakdowns, family boundaries, and the cost of silence. Viewers discussed how public figures are often expected to absorb criticism quietly, especially when family is involved. Blueface's decision to finally speak disrupted that expectation. It challenged the idea that staying silent is always the more mature choice. The term he almost stopped fitting. What started as gossip evolved into something heavier, a narrative correction. And corrections tend to provoke stronger reactions than new information. People don't like realizing they may have misunderstood a situation for a long time. That discomfort showed up everywhere from defensive comments to sudden overcorrections in support. The internet was recalibrating in real time. By the latter half of Part 2's circulation, attention shifted again, this time toward what might come next. Viewers wondered if more details would surface, or if this episode marked a stopping point. The way Blueface spoke suggested closure, but not resolution. He sounded like someone who had said what he needed to say, not someone trying to win an argument. That distinction left the audience uneasy. Closure without reconciliation often signals lasting distance. The biggest impact of Part 2 wasn't outrage, it was doubt. Doubt about past narratives. Doubt about who controlled the story. Doubt about what else might have been left unsaid. And doubt is sticky. It doesn't disappear when the next trend arrives. It reshapes how people interpret future moments. From now on, anything involving Blueface and Karlissa would be viewed through this new lens. By the end of this phase, one thing was undeniable: Part 2 had shifted power. Not decisively, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Blueface reclaimed space in a conversation he'd long been discussed in but rarely centered within. Whether people agreed with him or not, they had to acknowledge his voice. And in the economy of public narratives, being heard even controversially is a form of control. This wasn't the loudest moment in his story, but it might be one of the most consequential. By the time the conversation reached its third phase, the shock had fully settled and been replaced by something far more uncomfortable: acceptance. Not agreement, acceptance. The audience had stopped arguing over whether Blueface should have aired out Karlissa's tea and started grappling with the reality that he already did, and that the fallout couldn't be undone. This is the stage where stories become permanent, where narratives lock into place not because they're proven, but because they've been emotionally processed. And once that happens, everything that comes after is filtered through the new lens. What stood out most in this phase was how differently people were talking about Blueface. Not as a provocateur, not as a chaos agent, but as someone who finally broke a long silence. That reframing didn't make him universally sympathetic, but it made him legible in a way he hadn't been before. Viewers began describing him as fed up, tired, and done explaining. Those words matter because they shift the story from drama to exhaustion. And exhaustion is hard to argue with. You can debate facts, but you can't easily dismiss fatigue, especially when it's been visible over time. At the same time, Karlissa's role in the story became more complex, not simpler. The absence of an immediate response allowed multiple interpretations to coexist. Some believed silence was strategic. Others saw it as restraint. A few interpreted it as shock. What mattered wasn't which interpretation was correct, but that the silence gave Blueface's account room to breathe. In public discourse, space is power. And for the first time in a long while, the space wasn't immediately filled with counter-narratives. That imbalance subtly shifted perception, even among people who were previously critical of him. As viewers revisited past moments with this new context, a pattern emerged. Many of the most controversial incidents now look less like isolated explosions and more like pressure points. Moments where tension had been building but never properly addressed. Blueface's airing out in Part 2 didn't introduce brand new accusations. It reframed old ones. That distinction is crucial. New claims invite skepticism. Reframed history invites reconsideration. And reconsideration is quieter but far more lasting. The reaction ecosystem reflected that shift. Content creators stopped chasing reactions and started offering interpretations. Long-form videos replaced clips. Comment sections filled with paragraphs instead of one-liners. People were thinking out loud, working through discomfort rather than reacting impulsively. That kind of engagement signals a deeper investment. The story had moved beyond tea and into meaning. And once meaning enters the picture, the audience doesn't disengage easily. Another notable change was how people discussed boundaries. Family dynamics became a central theme. Viewers debated whether airing things out publicly is ever justified when relatives are involved, but those debates were no longer abstract. They were grounded in this specific case. People acknowledged that silence can protect others, but it can also erase oneself. That tension resonated widely, especially with viewers who've experienced similar dynamics in their own lives. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about celebrities, it was relatable. And relatability is what gives narratives endurance. Blueface's demeanor continued to be dissected, but now with a different emphasis. Early reactions focused on what he said. Later reactions focused on how he said it. In part 3 of the public conversation, people noticed the lack of escalation. No follow-up rants. No doubling down. No victory laps. That restraint was read as finality, as if he'd said his piece and was prepared to live with the consequences. That posture suggested resolution on his end, even if reconciliation remained unlikely. And resolution, even when messy, often earns a degree of respect. Karlissa's continued silence, meanwhile, shifted from being interpreted as tactical to being seen as a wild card. The longer it lasted, the more people wondered whether a response would help or hurt. Some believed speaking now would reopen wounds. Others believed silence allowed assumptions to harden. That dilemma itself became part of the story. Viewers weren't waiting for drama anymore, they were wondering if there was any version of a response that wouldn't escalate things further. That's when you know a situation has reached emotional saturation. One of the most significant developments in this phase was how the audience recalibrated blame. Early on, blame was directional, aimed squarely at one person or the other. Now, it became distributed. People talked about miscommunication, long-standing resentment, and the cost of unresolved conflict. That diffusion didn't absolve anyone, but it softened extremes. The story matured. It became less about villains and more about breakdowns. And breakdowns don't offer clean endings. The term T felt increasingly inadequate. What was aired out wasn't gossip, it was grievance. And grievances don't evaporate when exposed. They linger, reshape relationships, and redefine boundaries. Blueface's decision to speak publicly forced those grievances into the open, where they could no longer be managed privately. That exposure changed the future of the relationship, regardless of intentions. Even if no more words are exchanged, the dynamic has shifted permanently. As time passed, attention didn't disappear, it redistributed. The story stopped trending explosively, but it remained present in conversations about accountability, family, and narrative control. Family and narrative control. That kind of persistence is more impactful than virality. It means the episode will be referenced, not replayed. Remembered, not just watched. And remembered stories shape reputations long after the moment passes. Perhaps the most telling sign of this phase was how people talked about what's next, not in terms of new drama, but in terms of distance. Would Blueface step back further? Would Karlissa choose privacy over response? Would this mark the end of public back and forth entirely? Those questions assumed separation, not escalation. And that assumption signaled an emotional endpoint. The audience wasn't craving another chapter, they were processing the close of one. By the end of this phase, the conversation had settled into a quiet understanding. Something fundamental had changed. Not loudly, not cleanly, but decisively. Blueface had reclaimed his voice at a cost. Karlissa had been pulled into a spotlight she may not have wanted. And the audience, having witnessed it unfold, adjusted its expectations accordingly. This wasn't a moment that begged for resolution. It was a moment that created distance. And in stories like this, distance is often the most lasting consequence of all. Before you tap out, remember this: celebrity stories don't end when the clip stops. They evolve in silence, in reactions, and in the moves people make after the cameras are off. That's where Celeb Sync comes in. We don't just repeat headlines, we connect them. We track the moments before the fallout and the shifts most people overlook while scrolling. If you stayed through this, it's because you felt that change in tone too. The point where this stopped being tea and started being something real. Celeb Sync is for viewers who want context, not chaos. Insight, not noise. So if you want to stay aligned with what's really happening behind the scenes, like this video, drop a comment with your take. And subscribe to Celeb Sync for breakdowns that don't miss the beat. Stay connected. Stay informed. This is Celeb Sync.